Greetings, everybody. I'm Scott Rodell here at the Great River Taoist Center, home to our Academy of Chinese Swordsmanship, and this is episode 4 in our Imjin War Duel Series, The Dragon's Talons. Now, we already looked at many other weapons from the Ming Dynasty in an earlier episode, so this is a kind of a part 2 for the Dragon's Talons, and this is going to focus on the Ming Jian. During the late Ming period, there were basically 2 types of jian in use: the single-handed variety, and of course, the two-handed jian, the shuangshou jian. During the late Ming period, probably because the infantry forces were facing many mounted foes in the forms of the Mongols and then later the Manchus, there was this resurgent interest in the two-handed weapons. Now, China has a 2,000-year history of two-handed weapons, both jian and dao, and you can imagine yourself as an infantryman with a horseman riding down on you. It probably feels really good to have a longer, heavier blade to defend yourself with. So during the late Ming, we definitely saw this kind of resurgence. And again, China has a 2,000-year history of long-bladed, two-handed swords. So it's not really surprising that we saw this resurgence during that late Ming period. But before we look at the shuangshou jian, let's take a look at the single-handed jian. Now, most soldiers, most troopers during the Imjin Wars, by that late Ming period, would have carried dao. That would have been the common sidearm for any soldier. But when it came to officers, and we can see this very clearly in period art, the majority of them, maybe perhaps all of them, from what the art seems to indicate, carried jian. And that was very much a symbol of their rank as much as any sort of practical use. And if you think about it, any officer, his weapon is really his troops. If an officer, especially a higher-ranking officer, has to draw his sword, whatever type it is, things have gone really wrong. He should have been directing his troops and not having to use his sword at all. Unfortunately, I just have this one example from the Ming period to show you, but it's a fairly good representative example. I have been able to handle many other pieces in museum collections and private collections. And one thing I found is really clear is that if you handle both Ming and Qing period pieces, especially sort of side by side, you'll see there isn't really any substantial difference in how they handle. Their lengths are generally about the same, weights, all the sorts of things you would expect. Because, what a good swordsman in the late Ming and early Qing or later Qing would have needed, the kind of balance and handling that you need in a sword in a jian are going to remain the same. So as far as handling goes, I would say that I didn't see any essential difference between a Ming and Qing period jian, not any more than you would see between jian within any period. Not every Qing jian or every Ming jian is balanced exactly the same. So within that normal sort of variance that you find in any period, whether Ming or Qing, I wouldn't say there's any substantial difference at all between those of the Ming period and the Qing period. Where we see the differences are in the blade form and in the fittings. But before we look at those differences in blade form and fittings, let's take a quick look at this particular, I would say, dwan jian from the Ming period. It's not a particularly long blade. It's 23.5 inches. That's 61 centimeters. It's a really solid, heavy blade, I would say. You could say a stout blade at just under 2 pounds, 880 grams. It can deliver a really solid, robust cut. I mean, it's the kind of cut that you could really take off a limb with. It's also, you can see a very thick cross-section. And I would say this is really indicative of the kind of jian that an officer would have carried. Perhaps, who knows, perhaps this one even rode into Korea. No way, of course, to know that, but it's kind of fun to think it might have been. But, at nearly 2 pounds, even though it's so short compared to, say, a 29-inch blade, I would feel no problem that I could deflect and countercut pretty much any weapon coming at me. It's just such a good, solid blade. And we often find that with dwan jian. They tend to be a little bit heavier than their longer cousins, if you will, the chang jian. And, that allows them to have the mass that they would need to deflect even a pole arm coming at them. So I think this is a really good example of the type of jian we would see a Ming officer carrying. Now, I think in illustrations, you're not going to see a shorter sword like this because obviously in a painting, if you're trying to show off and you have your armor on and everything, you're going to have a little longer sword. But practically speaking, especially one like this that has just straight up solid iron fittings, this is meant for use. I'd say this is what I would expect an officer to be carrying, especially maybe one mid-rank, a little bit closer into the front. If we look at the blade form itself, it has this really, what is very typical of the Ming style. You see this very angular kind of tip. And we see this depicted over and over and over again in art. Unfortunately, today, many people think that Ming swords had a round kind of tip, which doesn't really make much sense. If you're thinking of it as a weapon you're going to thrust with, obviously a rounded half circle kind of tip wouldn't penetrate very well. The reason we see that is because these very angular sides and fronts, this kind of tip very easily wears and it gets rounded over time. If we take a look at all examples of period art we can find, whether it's the Wu Bei Zhi, other period manuals and encyclopedias, if we look at, there's a wonderful polychrome guardian statue that dates from the 17th century, they all have this very angular tip. There's no Ming Jian, no Ming period artwork that is depicting Jian with that rounded tip. So that's simply that rounding came over time, because when you have those, here you see, even here it's a little bit rounded. When you have a strict V form there, those edges, those corners very easily get rounded off. So that's the only reason we see rounded ones in the few Ming examples. But of course we see in this example, it's still there, it's slightly rounded, but you can see that V that we see very clearly depicted in period art. There are also two beautiful existing examples of Ming period Jian that very clearly have this angular tip. One dates from the 17th century and was given by the Yongle Emperor to a Taoist priest. And that's a rather, obviously very fancy kind of piece. The blade is in beautiful, excellent condition. It has a jade handle, which wouldn't have been common, but that, of course, was for a Taoist priest, so it's a different sort of situation. It was probably intended for ritual, but we can see very clearly when we look at that Jian, because it's nice and crisp, it was never used, never repolished over and over as a sword that saw combat would have been, that it has that very crisp, angular, V-shaped point. The other existing period example that's virtually untouched, probably has never been repolished, dates from the late Ming dynasty, was presented to Nurhaci by the court. And again, we can see that's a rather flamboyant piece, probably meant as sort of a court sword. It was presented by the Ming court to Nurhaci, the founder of the Qing dynasty. And that has a very, it's really nice, as I said, quite a flamboyant piece. And it has, of course, that very angular tip, and we see it quite clearly. So again, if we go back and we look at all the examples of period art we can find, we do not find that rounded sort of tip. Also, very commonly we see on Ming swords disc guards. Now, it's not always that case. Many of them also have the taotie, but it's interesting that during the Ming, even one like this, I don't think this is particularly early. It's probably a late Ming piece. As I said, this one really is about the right period. It might have gone to Korea. They tend to have these guards. Sometimes this one is a simple four-lobed guard, but a disc sort of guard. So what we would more typically see on sabers, but it's really rather uncommon to see this sort of disc guard on a Qing period Jian. So pretty much that's a characteristic you could say of Ming period Jian. And if we look at the tomb figures outside of Beijing, you'll see this again and again in art. Very commonly you see that kind of guard. The pommels are also quite different on Ming period Jian. This one is a closed one. Many of them are open and have the lanyard that you can hold it to your wrist. Some people call it a sword tassel, but it's really a loop, a lanyard that runs through here. That's another kind of difference that we see on Qing period Jian. The hole for that lanyard is in the grip. It's not the case on Ming. On Ming, they're in the pommel. So not always, obviously this example is solid, but very commonly that is an open guard. Either has a hole or just regular hole, or it's just kind of the general shape of the pommel is all open, and that's for that lanyard to run through. And you use that very simply, you put imagine that loop is there, you put your hand through that loop, and then you take your jian, and so that's going over your wrist so that if you were to drop it in combat, you don't lose your sword, it doesn't fall to the ground. About this one, as I was saying earlier, this one is solid and it has this sort of pyramid shape or triangular kind of shape. It's a little different. They're not all this way, but this shape, as you see, is very common during the Ming and not so much during the Qing. I should probably also point out that while I would say that this sort of duanjian is probably really indicative of what at least mid-level officers were carrying, probably not, maybe not the higher up guys, but the guys who are really close to the action because it's short, stout, but it doesn't get in your way as an officer, whether it's in the scabbard or in your hand, you're walking around or directing your troops. This is a really good example of the kind of piece I would expect an officer in the fray to be carrying. That very definitely other officers, Ming officers higher up, and also maybe mid-level. It's hard to know exactly. We don't have statistics. We can't go back in time and check. But I would say that also people were carrying 29, 30-inch sort of full-length jian as well. Now let's have a look at this shuangshou jian. This pion, really nice heavy piece. This sword is just shy of 32 inches long, so quite a good long length. That's 82 centimeters, and it's over 2 pounds, 2 pounds, 12 ounces. So not quite 3 pounds, but it's a really hefty piece. That is 1,250 grams. So good, solid, heavy sword. This piece, I think, probably dates from the Qing period. The only way I could say for sure would be to examine the tang, and really not going to take it apart. It can be a bit of trouble and probably would damage the grip in doing so. So not the kind of thing that we do unless we really need to. But reason I wanted to present it, well, I don't have a Ming period one, unfortunately, I can share with you. But also, if we look at this piece and look at the grip, it really looks very similar in size and length and in general form to those we see in the Shuangshou Jian manual from the late Ming period. So I think that's a good representative example of what we would have seen. And another interesting thing about this piece is although the grip is relatively short, you might think, oh, is it just a really heavy single-handed? No, it's definitely not. At 1,250 grams, there's just no way I'm going to be swinging this for very long with one hand. Also, it's got a lot of mass up to the front, was going to pull it forward, so it would be hard to control. But as soon as you get it in two hands, it really starts to move very nicely. So it's a really clearly a piece that you could wield and use to fight with. I do kind of have a question about how widely these were really employed during the late Ming and into the Imjin War period, or in the Imjin War period, because we don't see a lot of them in period art. In fact, other than what we see in the manual and the Wupei, you don't really see them. So I think there's no question they were in use. Obviously, here's an example. They existed, but I don't think they were in particularly widespread kind of use. But it's the kind of thing that we always can use more research and see what we can find. The problem, of course, in studying any Ming weapons is that we're looking at something that's 400 plus years ago. It's hard to find physical examples, and we have to look a lot, as we have, at period artwork that tell us as much as we can about the weapons. So I feel rather fortunate to have this one example that can give me a good idea of how they're wielded. So that's a look at some Ming period jian, real focus on these kind of weapons that officers would have been carrying. The sword that I'm using in the duels, of course, is one that's 31 inches long because I didn't want to give up that length. Please make sure that you're subscribed and hit the bell so you hear when the new episode is out. And also, if you would consider, please hit that join bell. That really helps us produce more videos for you. If you like this content, we really can use your support. Every single dollar that we get in from subscriptions stays with the channel and is used to make more videos for you. So if you can afford a few bucks, we really appreciate your support. Until next time, everybody, stay strong. 再见.